Melissa's voice cut through the cold air like breaking glass. "Leave. You're useless here." For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. The porch light above us buzzed faintly, casting a harsh yellow glow over the boxes already stacked near the door. Ryan stood just behind her, shoulders stiff, eyes fixed somewhere above my head, anywhere but on my face. "Melissa," I said quietly, my voice barely steady. "It's late. Let's talk about this in the morning." But she didn't answer me. Instead, she bent down, grabbed the nearest box, and shoved it forward with both hands. It slid across the wooden floor, tipped at the edge of the doorway, and tumbled down the front steps. I heard the sharp, sickening crack of porcelain hitting concrete. A dish. One of the old ones. I watched the pieces scatter across the driveway like white fragments of bone. Ryan stepped forward then. For one foolish second, I thought he was going to stop her. Instead, he picked up another box, the one with the framed photographs, and carried it past me without a word. He didn't look at me. Not once. Behind us, I saw curtains twitch across the street. Mrs. Hargrove's porch light flicked on, flooding her yard with pale light. I felt the weight of invisible eyes pressing into my back. I should have fought. I remember thinking, I should have shouted. I should have demanded answers. But I didn't, because deep down, somewhere beneath the shock and humiliation, there was a strange stillness growing inside me. And when that second box hit the driveway, something slid loose inside it, something small and sealed, something I recognized immediately. Ryan set the last box down hard enough to make it bounce against the porch railing. Then Melissa stepped back inside and slammed the front door so violently the frame rattled. A second later, I heard the unmistakable sound of the lock turning. Ryan stayed inside. He didn't come back out. The wind lifted loose papers from one of the boxes and carried them across the driveway. I stood there for several seconds, staring at the closed door, waiting for it to open again. It didn't. The silence that followed was louder than the shouting had been. I bent down slowly and picked up the broken dish pieces. My fingers trembled as I gathered them into the edge of my scarf, wrapping them carefully, as if preserving something that could never be repaired. That dish had belonged to my mother. Melissa had never liked my dishes. She said they were old-fashioned, said they didn't match her kitchen style. But I had kept them anyway, tucked neatly into the cabinet, washing them after every family dinner like quiet little pieces of memory. A thin envelope slid from beneath one of the shattered frames and landed near my shoe. I froze. Even before I picked it up, I knew exactly what it was. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, strong. Steady strokes I had traced with my fingertips more times than I could count. My husband's handwriting. I slipped the envelope into my handbag without opening it. Not yet. Not here. I began gathering the rest of my belongings, moving slowly, methodically. Shirts folded, papers stacked, photographs wiped clean and tucked into the suitcase I had dragged outside earlier. I had moved into Ryan's house after my husband died. At the time, they told me it would be temporary, just until I got back on my feet, just until the grief softened enough to breathe again. Melissa had smiled warmly back then. "It'll be good for everyone," she had said. "We can help each other." And for a while, it had felt that way. I cooked dinner every evening, packed lunches, walked my grandson to the bus stop in the mornings. I kept the house tidy, folded laundry, wiped counters, made myself useful in every small way I knew how. But usefulness, I learned, has an expiration date in some homes. The first time I heard Melissa call me a burden, she didn't know I was standing just outside the kitchen. "We can't keep supporting her forever," she had whispered to Ryan. Supporting me, as if I were something fragile, something dependent, something incapable of standing on my own. I swallowed that moment whole and said nothing. Just like tonight. The front door creaked open suddenly, and Ryan stepped halfway outside. He still wouldn't meet my eyes. He carried one final bag. Without a word, he placed it beside my suitcase and turned back toward the door. "Ryan?" I said softly. He paused. But only for a second. Then he walked back inside. No apology, no explanation. Just silence. Inside the final bag, I noticed a familiar folder, one I had kept hidden carefully for years. I stared at it for several seconds, my heart thudding slowly against my ribs. I thought it had been buried deep enough that no one would ever notice it. Apparently, I had been wrong. Across the street, Mrs. Hargrove stood at the edge of her porch now, arms folded tightly across her chest. "Do you have somewhere to go?" she asked gently. I forced a smile I didn't feel. "Yes," I said. The truth was, I hadn't decided yet. Not completely. But I knew one thing for certain. I would not beg to stay. I zipped my suitcase closed, lifted it into the trunk of my car, and placed my handbag carefully on the passenger seat. My hand lingered on the envelope inside, tracing the outline through the leather. His handwriting, his promise. My husband had given it to me years ago, long before illness had taken his strength, long before grief had swallowed our quiet routines. "Keep this safe," he had told me once. "One day, you might need it more than you realize." I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. For a moment, I sat there, staring at the house through the windshield. The same house where I had celebrated birthdays, baked holiday pies, watched my grandson take his first steps. Now it felt like a stranger's home. As I pulled away from the curb, I caught a glimpse of Ryan standing behind the front window, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. He didn't wave. He didn't call my name. And just as my car reached the end of the street, the porch light snapped off behind me. Gone. Like I had never belonged there at all. I drove only a few blocks before pulling over to the side of the road. My hands tightened around the steering wheel, my breath shallow but steady. Then, slowly, I reached into my handbag and pulled out the envelope. The paper felt heavier than it should have. I opened it carefully. Inside was a small brass key and a folded document with an address printed neatly across the top. An address I recognized immediately. I stared at it for a long time before whispering the words aloud. They thought I was leaving with nothing. My fingers curled tightly around the key. But they had no idea what I still owned. I woke with a sharp ache running down my neck and into my shoulders. The kind that comes from sleeping in a position your body was never meant to hold. For a moment, I didn't remember where I was. Then the cold air inside the car pressed against my skin, and everything came rushing back. The dark driveway, the slammed door, the lock turning. I shifted slightly in the driver's seat, wincing as stiffness pulled through my back. My breath fogged faintly against the windshield. Outside, the early morning sky carried that dull gray color that made everything feel heavier than usual. My handbag rested beside me, exactly where I had left it. Slowly, I reached over and touched it. The envelope was still inside. Just feeling its shape through the leather steadied something inside my chest. I took it out again, careful, almost reverent, and unfolded the paper once more. The address stared back at me. I had seen it before, years ago, back when my husband still walked beside me, when we still made decisions together late into the night at the kitchen table. But I hadn't visited that place in a long time. Not since everything changed. I started the engine and let it idle, watching the street ahead. For a few seconds, my hands hovered over the wheel, uncertain. Part of me wanted to drive back, to knock on that door, to demand an explanation. But the image of Melissa's voice, cold and sharp, pushed that thought away. "Leave. You're useless here." I swallowed hard and shifted the car into drive. Not back toward their house. Forward. Toward something unknown. The streets were quiet that morning. A few early commuters passed by, their headlights slicing through the gray air. As I drove, I caught myself glancing at my phone resting in the cup holder, half hoping it would ring, half fearing it would. The screen lit suddenly, and my breath caught. An incoming call. For a brief second, hope fluttered inside me, foolish, stubborn hope that it might be Ryan. But the number wasn't his. It was unfamiliar. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Then it stopped. The silence afterward felt heavier than the ringing had. I drove for nearly 20 minutes before pulling into a quiet part of town I hadn't visited in years. The buildings were older here, modest, worn, but still standing with quiet dignity. There was a small apartment building on the corner with a faded vacancy sign hanging crookedly in the window. I parked and sat there for a moment, gathering myself. Temporary, I told myself, just until I figured things out. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old carpet. The landlord, a tired-looking man with thin gray hair, glanced up from behind a small desk. "Looking for a place?" he asked. "Yes," I replied softly. He handed me a clipboard with a short rental application. "Short-term or long-term?" he asked without looking up. I hesitated. Short-term would mean uncertainty, constant movement, no ground beneath my feet. Long-term meant commitment, stability. I swallowed and circled the second option. "Long-term," I said quietly. The word felt heavier than expected, but also strangely comforting. An hour later, I stood inside the small studio apartment that would become my temporary refuge. The room was plain, beige walls, thin carpet, a narrow kitchen counter tucked into one corner. No decorations, no memories, just space. I placed my suitcase beside the wall and sat down at the tiny kitchen table, pulling the envelope from my handbag once again. This time, I opened it fully. Inside, the brass key rested against the paper, its edges worn smooth from years of handling. Beneath it lay a folded document, thicker than I remembered. Carefully, I spread the pages across the table. Unit numbers, multiple ones, not just one address. Several. My breath slowed as recognition crept into my thoughts. Years ago, my husband and I had worked quietly, saving every spare dollar. We bought small rental units, nothing grand. Nothing flashy, just modest apartments in neighborhoods where working families lived. We had managed them ourselves in the beginning. Cleaning, repairing, painting walls late into the night. After he fell ill, everything blurred together. Hospital visits, medication schedules, endless exhaustion. And somewhere along the way, I stepped back from daily management. Harold Benton stepped in. The memory surfaced clearly now, his calm voice, his steady hands, his loyalty that never wavered. My fingers traced the number written faintly on the back of the document. I picked up my phone and dialed it. The line rang longer than I expected. Just when I thought no one would answer, a voice came through. "Hello." "Harold," I said carefully. "It's Eleanor." Silence followed. Then a slow exhale. "I wondered when you'd finally call," he replied. His voice carried familiarity, but also something deeper, something that sounded like patience. "I found the documents." I continued. "The ones my husband left." "I assumed you would eventually," he said. "Are you all right?" I paused before answering. "No," I admitted quietly. "But I will be—" There was another pause. Then Harold spoke again, more serious this time. "Do they know what you still have?" My grip tightened around the phone. "No," I said. "Good," he replied. "Because you're going to need to take control again." His words settled heavily in my chest. Take control. I hadn't heard those words in years. What exactly do I still have? "Harold," I asked carefully. He let out a low breath. "More than you remember," he said. "Those properties never stopped working for you. Rent was collected, maintenance handled, taxes paid." I stared down at the documents spread across the table. "You're telling me they're still active?" I whispered. "Yes," he answered. "And some of them have increased in value significantly." The room suddenly felt smaller, heavier. "Eleanor," he continued, "there's something else you need to do." "What?" I asked. "Go see one of them," he said. "The address on that paper? Start there." After we hung up, I sat motionless for several minutes. Then I picked up the brass key again. Its weight felt different now, not like a memory, but like responsibility. Later that morning, I drove toward the address listed on the paper. The neighborhood came into view slowly, familiar in a way that stirred old emotions. The building stood exactly where I remembered it. Older now, paint slightly faded, but still standing, still alive. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance, my footsteps slow but steady. The metal railing beside the stairs felt cool beneath my fingertips. A tenant stepped out just as I reached the door. She paused when she saw me, studying my face carefully. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then her expression softened slightly. "You look familiar," she said. I felt something shift inside me. Not fear, recognition. "Yes," I replied quietly. "I used to come here years ago." She nodded slowly. "Well," she added with a tired smile, "whoever owns this place now should probably come back more often. We've had problems that haven't been fixed in months." Her words settled into my thoughts like stones sinking into water. Problems, neglect, responsibility. After she walked past me, I stepped fully inside the building. The hallway lights flickered faintly overhead. A stain marked the ceiling near one corner, and the air carried the faint scent of dampness. I ran my hand along the wall as I walked. Memories rose quietly, nights spent scrubbing floors, painting trim, carrying supplies alongside my husband. We built this place piece by piece. Not inherited, not given, earned. I stepped back outside a few minutes later and sat inside my car again, staring at the building through the windshield. Yesterday, I had nowhere to go. Today, I sat in front of something that belonged to me. My phone buzzed suddenly in my hand. A message. Unknown sender. I opened it slowly. "We need to talk about the accounts." My heart skipped once. Sharp and sudden. I looked back at the building again, gripping the brass key tighter in my palm. Then I whispered the words aloud, barely louder than breath. "There are 12 of them. 12 apartments. Still in my name. Still under my control." And for the first time since that night on the driveway, I felt something rise inside me that wasn't grief. It was power. The next morning, I sat at the small kitchen table in my apartment long before the sun had fully risen. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I had barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, numbers flashed through my mind. Addresses, unit numbers, signatures, dates I hadn't thought about in years. I spread the documents across the table again, smoothing each page carefully as if touching them too quickly might make them disappear. The paper edges were yellowed, softened by time. Some pages carried faint smudges of ink where hands had pressed too firmly years ago. I studied the list of properties slowly, reading each address aloud under my breath. 12 units, 12 apartments, still tied to my name. My coffee sat untouched beside me, growing colder by the minute. I didn't notice until I reached for the mug and felt the chill seep through the ceramic into my fingers. One address caught my attention, not because of the numbers, but because of a faint mark beside it, a small highlight line drawn in faded ink. I frowned. I didn't remember marking it. I leaned closer, tracing the line with my fingertip. It looked older than the rest of the writing, slightly uneven, the way my husband used to mark important details when he wanted to remind himself of something. A quiet unease settled into my chest. Had he known something I didn't? I took a deep breath and began organizing the paperwork into small stacks. Property titles on one side, maintenance records on another, bank statements neatly aligned in a third pile. Order brought clarity. Clarity brought strength. But halfway through sorting, I noticed something strange. One document, a maintenance agreement, ended abruptly. The final page was missing. I flipped through the pile again, slower this time. Still nothing. My pulse quickened slightly. I sat back in my chair, pressing my fingers against my temples as a memory began to surface. Years earlier, before illness took hold of my husband, we had spent countless nights inside those very apartments. I could still see us clearly, sleeves rolled up, paintbrushes in hand, laughing quietly as we worked late into the evening. We didn't inherit those buildings. We built them, one unit at a time. I remembered carrying buckets of cleaning supplies up narrow staircases, scrubbing floors until my knees ached, folding rent receipts carefully into envelopes, counting every dollar twice before placing it into the ledger book. And one night, after we finished repainting a small kitchen, my husband had rested his hand gently on my shoulder. One day, he told me, his voice steady but tired, "These will protect you when no one else does." At the time, I smiled and brushed the thought aside. I never imagined the day would actually come. The memory faded slowly as I returned to the present. I turned toward my laptop and powered it on. The screen flickered before settling into place. My fingers hovered above the keyboard as I entered the login information for one of the old financial accounts. For a brief second, I expected the password to fail. But it didn't. The account opened. Rows of transactions filled the screen, stretching down farther than I could see at once. My breath slowed as I scrolled carefully. Rent deposits, maintenance payments, utility expenses. Everything looked normal at first glance. Until it didn't. Halfway down the page, a series of unfamiliar withdrawals appeared, larger than usual maintenance costs. Repeated entries under the same label. Property maintenance authorization. I leaned closer to the screen. The amounts were higher than anything I remembered approving. My chest tightened. I scrolled again. Another withdrawal. Another. And another. Each one listed under a shortened version of my own name. I stared at the screen, confusion twisting slowly into unease. Who authorized these? My hands trembled slightly as I reached for my phone and dialed Harold's number again. He answered quickly this time. "Eleanor, I'm looking at the account now," I said quietly. "There are payments I don't recognize." There was a pause on the other end. "How many?" he asked. "Several," I replied. "And they're recent?" Silence settled between us. Then his voice returned, more serious than before. "Did anyone ever have access to your login information?" The question struck harder than I expected. I closed my eyes briefly, searching my memory. Ryan. Years ago, he had helped me set up the online account, back when technology still confused me, when I relied on him to guide me through passwords and security steps. He saved the login details on the family computer. At the time, it felt convenient, safe. Now it felt like a mistake. "Yes," I admitted slowly. "Someone did." Harold didn't speak immediately. Instead, he exhaled slowly, as if weighing his next words carefully. "You should verify exactly where those authorizations came from," he said. After we ended the call, I grabbed my coat and drove straight to the nearest bank branch. The building stood tall and quiet, its glass doors reflecting the gray sky above. Inside, the fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow across polished floors. I approached the counter slowly, clutching the printed statements in my hand. A young clerk greeted me politely and asked for my identification. When she typed my name into the system, her expression shifted slightly, not alarmed, but attentive. "Please have a seat," she said. "Someone will assist you shortly." I sat in a cushioned chair near the back of the office, watching the clock tick forward second by second. Every movement felt louder than usual, every breath heavier. After several minutes, a bank officer approached and led me into a private room. We sat across from each other at a small desk. I handed over the documents. He reviewed them carefully, his eyes scanning each line in silence. Finally, he turned the screen toward me. "These authorization requests," he explained, "were submitted electronically." My throat tightened. "From where?" I asked quietly. He tapped a line on the screen. "A residential internet connection," he said. "From a location within your previous neighborhood." My pulse thudded loudly in my ears. The same neighborhood. Ryan's neighborhood. I stepped outside the bank a short time later. The printed records clutched tightly in my hand. The afternoon air felt heavier now, pressing against my chest as I sat inside my car. My fingers rested against the steering wheel, unmoving. Was this carelessness? Or betrayal? I didn't know. But for the first time, the possibility of betrayal didn't feel distant anymore. It felt close, too close. Later that evening, I returned to the apartment building again, the same one I had visited the day before. Lights glowed warmly through several windows, casting soft rectangles onto the pavement. Inside the hallway, the air felt damp. A dark stain spread across one section of the ceiling, larger than I remembered. I ran my hand along the wall and noticed the rough texture of peeling paint beneath my fingers. A tenant stepped into the hallway just ahead of me. "You're back," she said with mild surprise. "Yes," I replied quietly. She hesitated, then gestured toward the ceiling. "We reported that leak months ago," she said. "Nothing ever happened. Months. Neglect. Responsibility ignored." I nodded slowly, absorbing her words. Then I stepped outside again, pulling my phone from my pocket. I dialed Harold once more. "We need to schedule a full inspection," I told him firmly. My voice sounded different this time. Stronger, more certain. That night, back inside my apartment, I spread the bank records and property documents across the table once again. I wrote down dates, circled suspicious transactions, connected details one by one, until one amount caught my attention, larger than all the others. I circled it twice. Just as I leaned back in my chair, my laptop chimed softly. A new email. I opened it slowly. Subject line: Authorization request confirmation. Attached to the message was a digital form. My eyes moved down the page until they reached the signature section. Initials appeared there, familiar ones. Ryan's initials. I stared at the screen for a long time, the room growing quieter with every passing second. If he had touched what wasn't his, then everything was about to change. I didn't sleep much that night. The glow of my laptop screen stayed on until the early hours, casting a pale blue light across the kitchen table where papers lay scattered like fallen leaves. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ryan's initials again, sharp and unmistakable, sitting at the bottom of that authorization form. By morning, the coffee in my mug had gone cold twice. I sat there staring at the transaction logs, reading each line slowly, as if the truth might rearrange itself if I looked long enough. That's when I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before. The same company name appeared again and again beside the withdrawals. Property Support Services, LLC. I leaned closer to the screen, narrowing my eyes. The name meant nothing to me, yet it appeared on nearly every unusual transaction over the past several months. My stomach tightened. I opened a browser window and typed the company name into the search bar. A handful of results appeared, sparse information, barely anything detailed. A small business listing, a registration notice, no website, no public history. Too clean, too quiet. Then I saw the registered address. My breath caught. It was located in the same district where Ryan and Melissa lived. Not the same building, but close enough to feel like more than coincidence. Before I could finish processing the thought, my phone rang. Harold's name appeared on the screen. I answered immediately. "Eleanor," he said, his tone serious. "I was reviewing the historical management records this morning." Something in his voice made my chest tighten. "And," I asked. "There have been changes," he said slowly. "Management permissions were updated within the last year." My grip on the phone tightened. "I didn't authorize any changes," I said. "That's what concerns me," Harold replied. Silence stretched between us. "Did you sign anything recently?" he asked. "Any forms related to insurance, property updates, or account access?" The question settled into my thoughts like a heavy stone. And then, slowly, a memory surfaced. It had been last winter, just before the holidays. The house had been busy, filled with decorations and noise. Melissa had approached me in the kitchen with a small stack of papers in her hand. "Just routine updates," she had said cheerfully. "Insurance paperwork. Nothing complicated." I remembered standing near the counter, distracted by a pot boiling on the stove. The smell of cinnamon candles filled the air. "Just sign here," she had added, pointing to a blank line. "It's only a formality." I hadn't read every word. I trusted her. I trusted my son. Now, sitting at the kitchen table in my apartment, I felt the weight of that moment pressing into my chest. Yes, I whispered into the phone. I signed something. Harold exhaled quietly. That may have given them limited authority, he said. But from what I'm seeing, those recent transactions exceed that authority. Fear settled low in my stomach. Not panic. Not yet. Something colder. More focused. What do I do now? I asked. You need legal guidance, he said firmly. I recommend speaking with someone immediately. By early afternoon, I sat inside a quiet law office across town. The waiting room smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. Framed certificates lined the walls, each one carefully positioned behind glass. When my name was called, I stood slowly and followed the receptionist down a narrow hallway. Lisa Carter greeted me with a calm, professional smile. She listened without interrupting as I explained everything, the transactions, the company name, the documents I had signed months earlier. When I handed her the printed records, she studied them carefully. Her eyes moved slowly across each page, pausing at certain lines longer than others. At one point, her expression tightened slightly. May I ask? She said, looking up at me. Did you personally authorize these specific withdrawals? No, I replied firmly. She nodded once. Thoughtful. These earlier documents you signed, she continued, tapping lightly on one page, appear to grant temporary financial management permissions. My throat tightened. Temporary, I repeated. Yes, she said. Limited authority. But what concerns me is that these later transactions exceed what was originally allowed. A cold wave moved through me. So someone used my signature to take control. I asked quietly. Not full control, she replied, but attempted financial control beyond your stated permissions. Her words settled heavily between us. Attempted financial control. The phrase echoed inside my mind. Lisa leaned back slightly in her chair. Has anyone recently suggested you were having trouble managing your finances? She asked. I blinked. Caught off guard. Images surfaced, small moments I had dismissed at the time. Melissa correcting me in front of others. Ryan gently taking papers from my hands. Melissa once laughing lightly and saying, "You forget things sometimes." I swallowed hard. Yes, I admitted. Lisa nodded slowly. This pattern is sometimes used to establish legal dependency, she explained. If someone convinces others that you are unable to manage your affairs, they may attempt to justify increased authority over your assets. The realization hit harder than I expected. It wasn't just about money. It was about control. Control over my life. Control over my independence. Can I stop this? I asked quietly. Yes, Lisa replied. But we must act quickly. She outlined several steps, revoking previous authorizations, freezing questionable transactions, verifying property ownership records. As she spoke, something inside me shifted. Not fear. Resolve. For the first time since that night on the driveway, I felt something steady beneath my feet. After leaving her office, I drove past the apartment building again. The same tenants moved through the entrance. The same worn steps carried their weight. But this time, I saw the place differently. Not as a memory. As responsibility. That evening, I returned to my apartment and spread the legal notes across the table. Dates. Signatures. Company names. I wrote everything down carefully, building a timeline of events. One detail stood out above the rest. Melissa's name. I circled it slowly. Hours later, my email chimed softly. A new message from Lisa. I opened the attachment. A scanned authorization form filled the screen. My eyes moved downward until they reached the signature section. My signature appeared first. But beneath it, listed as a witness, was another name. Melissa Whitaker. My breath caught sharply. So she had been there. Watching. Participating. Before I could gather my thoughts, my phone began to vibrate against the table. Ryan's name flashed across the screen. I stared at it without moving. The ringing continued. Loud. Persistent. demanding attention. My finger hovered over the screen. But I didn't answer. I let it ring until the silence returned. Because now, for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I was preparing for it. The morning felt different the moment I opened my eyes. Not lighter, not easier, and just clearer. Like the fog that had clouded my thoughts for weeks was finally thinning enough for me to see the road ahead. I sat at the kitchen table again. Legal papers arranged neatly in front of me. Lisa's notes lay beside my coffee mug. Every step written in careful detail. Revoke permissions. Secure accounts. Verify ownership. Document everything. No guessing. No reacting. Only planning. My phone buzzed against the table, breaking the silence. I glanced down and saw Harold's name appear on the screen. Beneath it was a short message. Urgent, new opportunity. My pulse quickened slightly as I answered. Good morning. Harold, I said. Morning, he replied, his tone more alert than usual. I came across something you need to know about. I leaned back slightly, bracing myself. There's a building going up for sale, he continued. Older property. Needs work. But the location? He paused briefly. You'll want to see this one. What makes it different? I asked. He hesitated just long enough to build tension. It's across the street from your son's residential complex. The words landed heavily in my chest. Across the street. Not blocks away. Not in another neighborhood. Close enough to see from a window. For a moment, I said nothing. My fingers tightened around the phone as I pictured Ryan's apartment building, the familiar brick structure, the narrow balconies, the parking lot where I had once watched my grandson ride his bicycle. You're certain? I asked quietly. Completely, Harold replied. The current owner is under financial pressure. Needs to sell quickly. Which means the right offer could secure it before others step in. I stared down at the paperwork spread across my table, my mind already calculating possibilities. Owning that building wouldn't just give me stability. It would shift the balance. Send me the address, I said. A moment later, my phone chimed with the location details. I grabbed a folded map from my drawer and spread it across the table. Slowly, I traced the streets until I found the address Harold had sent. There it was. Directly across from Ryan's complex, my breath slowed as the realization settled in. This wasn't revenge. This was positioning. Later that afternoon, I drove to the address. The building stood on the corner. Older but solid. Its brick facade showed signs of wear, and the paint along the window frames had begun to peel. A faded sign near the entrance listed contact information for maintenance requests. Several papers had been taped haphazardly beneath it. Complaints. Requests. Ignored needs. I stepped out of the car and approached the front entrance slowly, my eyes scanning every detail. The sidewalk showed cracks. The railings along the stairs looked rusted in places. Neglect. The front door opened before I could knock. A woman stepped into the hallway, holding a laundry basket against her hip. She looked tired, her expression lined with quiet frustration. Are you here about the repairs? She asked without hesitation. The question caught me off guard. Repairs, I repeated. She nodded, shifting the basket in her arms. The heating system barely works. Water leaks from the ceiling near Unit 3. We've been waiting months. Months. Her words echoed in my mind. How long has it been like this? I asked. She sighed. Too long, she said. The owner hasn't shown up in ages. I nodded slowly, absorbing every detail. Responsibility. Need. Opportunity. Inside the hallway, the air carried a faint damp smell. A stain spread across the ceiling above the staircase, darker than the ones I had seen in my own building days earlier. The place wasn't failing. It was being ignored. A real estate agent met me inside a small office near the entrance later that afternoon. He spoke quickly, flipping through documents as he explained the situation. The current owner is dealing with heavy debt, he said. Missed loan payments. Mounting repair costs. He needs this property sold fast. How fast? I asked. He looked up from the papers. "Within weeks," he replied. "Possibly sooner if a qualified buyer steps forward." Qualified. The word echoed in my thoughts. That evening, I returned to Lisa's office, carrying the listing documents with me. She reviewed them carefully, her expression calm but attentive. "Financially, you're capable," she said after several minutes. "With the assets you still hold, this purchase is realistic. Realistic. Not reckless. Not impossible. Real." Back in my apartment that night, I spread the numbers across the table once more. Estimated repair costs, property taxes, rental income projections, risk balanced against reward, fear balanced against purpose. For a moment, doubt crept into my thoughts. Was this too much? Too soon. Then a memory surfaced, my husband standing beside me in one of our first apartments, handing me a set of keys with quiet confidence. "Real strength," he had said softly, "is building something that protects others." The memory settled my hands. This wasn't about revenge. It was about protection. Protection for myself. Protection for others who depended on these homes. I opened my laptop and began filling out the purchase offer form. Every field completed carefully. Every number reviewed twice. No hesitation. No second guessing. When I reached the final signature line, I paused for a moment. This was the point of no return. My hand hovered briefly above the keyboard. Then I signed. The confirmation screen appeared seconds later. Offer submitted. My heart beat steadily in my chest as I leaned back in my chair. Minutes passed. Then my phone chimed. A message from the agent. Offer received. Simple words. Heavy meaning. The next day passed slowly. Too slowly. I checked my phone more times than I cared to admit. Every vibration made my breath catch. Every silence stretched longer than it should. By late afternoon, just as I began preparing dinner, the phone buzzed again. This time, the message came from the agent. "Your offer has been accepted pending final review." I read the message twice. Then a third time. Accepted. The word felt unreal. I lowered myself into the kitchen chair, my hands resting flat against the table. Across the street from my son's building, that place would soon belong to me. As evening settled over the city, I stood by the window and stared out at the skyline. Lights flickered on in distant buildings, one after another. Somewhere among them was Ryan's apartment. Unaware, unprepared, for what was coming. Just as I turned away from the window, my phone vibrated once more. A new message from Lisa. "We discovered additional authorization activity." My chest tightened instantly. Attached to the message was a document labeled, "Pending Financial Transfer." I opened the file slowly. Numbers filled the screen. Large numbers. Unfamiliar ones. My breath slowed as realization crept in. They weren't finished. Not yet. I stared at the glowing screen. The quiet room pressing around me like a tightening circle. "They're still trying to take from me," I whispered. And for the first time, I understood clearly. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was war. The date printed at the top of the contract stopped me cold. I stared at it longer than I should have, my fingers resting against the edge of the paper. It was the same date, exactly 1 month since the night my boxes had been thrown onto the driveway and my life had been pushed out the front door. Same day, same month, different ending. The stack of documents sat neatly in front of me on the small kitchen table, each page marked with colored tabs Lisa had placed carefully along the edges. I ran my fingers across the paper, feeling the weight of what was about to happen. This wasn't just paperwork. This was control. I finished my coffee, folded the checklist into my handbag, and stood slowly. My hands felt steady, surprisingly steady, considering how much rested on what I was about to do. The drive to Lisa's office felt longer than usual. Traffic crawled along the main road, each red light stretching time into something thick and heavy. A low layer of clouds hung above the city, dulling the morning light. My phone vibrated once in the cup holder. I glanced down. A missed call. Ryan. I didn't answer. Not yet. I pulled into the parking lot and turned off the engine, sitting there for a moment before stepping out. The air felt colder than it should have been for that time of year. Inside Lisa's office, everything felt calm, almost too calm. She greeted me with the same steady expression she always wore. Professional but reassuring. "Ready?" she asked. I nodded. She guided me to her desk, where the final ownership documents lay waiting. Thick, formal pages printed in sharp black ink. "This is the final transfer agreement," she explained. "Once you sign, the property becomes entirely yours. Entirely yours." The words echoed in my mind as I picked up the pen. I read each page slowly, not skimming, not rushing. Every sentence mattered now. Every line carried responsibility. Lisa watched quietly as I reviewed the final section. When I reached the signature line, I paused. For just a second. Not because I doubted. Because I understood. Then I signed. The pen moved smoothly across the page, leaving behind a dark line of ink that changed everything. Lisa stamped the document firmly. The sharp sound of the stamp hitting paper echoed through the room like a small declaration. "It's done," she said. "Done." The word settled deep inside me. She explained what would happen next. System updates. Ownership records changing. Tenant notifications being sent automatically. "Some people will notice these changes sooner than expected," she added carefully. I understood what she meant, and I didn't look away from the reality of it. By early afternoon, I stood in front of the building that now legally belonged to me. The key felt cool in my hand as I approached the entrance. My steps were slow but deliberate. I paused at the door for a moment before inserting the key into the lock. The metal clicked softly. The door opened. Not as a visitor. As the owner. Inside. The hallway smelled faintly of damp wood and old paint. The same tenant I had spoken with days earlier appeared at the far end of the corridor. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw me. "You're back," she said. "Yes," I replied. But this time, my voice carried something new. Authority. She stepped closer, her expression cautious but hopeful. "Are the repairs going to happen?" she asked. Her question wasn't demanding, it was tired, worn down from waiting too long. "Yes," I said firmly. "They will." Her shoulders relaxed slightly. "There were eviction notices planned," she added quietly. "Several of us were told to prepare." My chest tightened. Evictions. Families pushed out. Lives disrupted. I pulled out my phone immediately and dialed Harold. "Stop any eviction notices," I told him without hesitation. Immediately. There was no pause on his end. "I'll handle it," he said. I ended the call and stood there for a moment, listening to the building breathe around me. Pipes hummed faintly behind the walls. Floorboards creaked overhead. This place wasn't broken. It had simply been ignored. I began walking through the building slowly, inspecting every corner. The basement carried the smell of standing water. A rusted pipe dripped steadily into a bucket placed beneath it. Upstairs, a hallway light flickered weakly, threatening to burn out completely. Then I noticed a door marked with a red maintenance warning. My hand hovered near the frame before I stepped closer. Neglect. Danger. Responsibility. Every problem I saw strengthened something inside me. Not fear. Determination. Later that afternoon, my phone rang again. Unknown number. I answered cautiously. Silence. No voice. Just faint static. Then the line disconnected. A chill moved through me. When I checked the call log moments later, the location traced back to the same neighborhood Ryan lived in. I didn't know if it was coincidence or curiosity, but I felt the pressure tightening. That evening, back in my apartment, my inbox filled with notifications, one after another. Ownership confirmation. Tenant records updated. Utility accounts transferred. Each email displayed my full legal name in bold letters. Eleanor Whitaker, property owner. I opened one attachment slowly. Inside was a directory listing, updated records showing ownership assignments across multiple addresses. As I scrolled, one line caught my attention. Ryan's residential complex, listed directly across from my newly purchased building. I leaned back in my chair and pulled out the neighborhood map again, spreading it across the table. Slowly, I traced each location. One building, then another, a cluster forming around a single point. Ryan's daily life would cross my path whether he realized it or not. My phone buzzed again. Voicemail notification. Ryan's name. I hesitated before pressing play. "Mom, we need to talk," his voice said. Tense. Uneasy. Minutes later, another voicemail arrived. "Melissa." Her voice sounded sharper, more controlled. "Call us back," she said. "This is important." I didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, I opened the final email waiting in my inbox. Ownership directory update complete. I clicked the attachment. A long list of names filled the screen. Slowly, I scrolled downward. Then I saw it. My name, printed clearly beside the building directly facing Ryan's residence. I stared at the screen. The quiet room pressing in around me. "They're about to find out," I whispered softly. And when they did, nothing would ever be the same again. I parked across the street just as the morning sun began to creep over the rooftops. The air felt cool and still, carrying that strange quiet that comes before a storm, even when the sky looks calm. I sat behind the wheel, hands resting lightly on my lap, watching the entrance to Ryan's building. I had parked there before, years ago, waiting to pick up my grandson from school, bringing groceries, dropping off casseroles after long days. Back then, this street had felt familiar. Today, it felt different, measured, purposeful. Across the street, a maintenance worker stepped out of the building I now owned, carrying a clipboard under his arm. He walked toward the front notice board and began taping a sheet of paper carefully against the glass. I didn't need to get closer to know what it said. Ownership update. Official notice. My name printed clearly where everyone could see it. A few residents passed by, slowing slightly as they noticed the fresh paper. Some paused. Some leaned closer to read. I stayed where I was, breathing slowly, watching the moment unfold. Then the front door of Ryan's building opened. My chest tightened slightly. Ryan stepped outside, adjusting his jacket as he moved toward the sidewalk. He looked tired, shoulders tense, jaw tight, like someone who hadn't slept well. He walked without looking up, heading straight toward the parking area. And then he stopped. Not because he saw me, because he saw the notice. I watched from across the street as his eyes moved slowly across the paper. At first, his expression remained neutral, casual curiosity. Nothing more. Then his body stiffened. His hand reached out, gripping the edge of the board. He leaned closer. Read again. And then again. I saw it in the way his shoulders froze, the way his breath seemed to pause mid-motion. Recognition. Shock. Disbelief. He stepped back slowly, staring at the paper as if it might change if he looked long enough. Behind him, the door opened again. Melissa stepped outside, holding her purse in one hand. "What happened?" she asked, her voice sharp with impatience. Ryan didn't answer. Instead, he lifted his hand and pointed at the notice. Melissa frowned and stepped closer, leaning toward the glass. I watched her face carefully as she read. Confusion, then tension, then fear. Her lips parted slightly. "This can't be right," she whispered. A few nearby tenants gathered closer, whispering quietly among themselves. The soft murmur of voices carried faintly across the street. Curiosity spreading, awareness growing. One tenant turned and looked directly at me. Recognition flashed across her face. She nudged another resident and gestured in my direction. Ryan followed the movement of her hand, and then his eyes found mine. For a moment, everything else disappeared. No traffic, no voices, just the space between us. His face shifted slowly from confusion into something deeper, realization settling in like a slow-moving shadow. Melissa turned next. The instant she saw me standing across the street, her expression hardened into shock. Ryan didn't hesitate. He stepped off the curb and began walking toward me. Fast. Melissa followed closely behind him. I stayed exactly where I was. Didn't step back. Didn't turn away. Each of his footsteps sounded louder than the last, echoing against the pavement. When he reached me, he stopped just inches away, his breathing uneven. "Mom," he said, his voice barely steady. "What is this?" I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence stretch between us, long enough for the truth to settle into his thoughts. Then I spoke. "It means the building across the street belongs to me." My voice stayed calm, steady. Melissa shook her head sharply. "That's impossible," she said quickly. "There has to be some mistake." I turned my gaze toward her. "There isn't," I replied. Ryan blinked several times, his eyes darting between me and the building behind us. You own that place?" he asked. "Yes." Silence followed. Heavy. Unavoidable. "And not just that one," I added quietly. Ryan's face drained of color. Melissa's hands trembled slightly at her sides. Several tenants had gathered nearby now, pretending not to stare but clearly listening. Melissa spoke first, her words rushing out too quickly. "There must be confusion," she insisted. "We didn't know about any of this." Ryan rubbed his forehead, his breathing shallow. "I didn't know," he said, his voice cracking. "Mom, I swear, I didn't know." For a moment, I studied his face carefully, searching, measuring. Years of memories moved through my thoughts. Birthday parties, school events, quiet dinners around the table. Then the image of that night returned. Boxes thrown onto the driveway, porcelain breaking, the door slamming shut. "I stood outside that house," I said quietly, "with everything I owned in boxes." Ryan lowered his eyes. Melissa said nothing. "You didn't ask where I was going," I continued. "You didn't ask if I had somewhere safe to sleep." Ryan swallowed hard. "I was wrong," he said hoarsely. "I should have stopped it." Melissa shifted uneasily beside him. "We thought," she began, then stopped. "Thought what?" "That I had nothing. That I was powerless. I didn't need to ask. I already knew." "I'm not here to punish you," I said calmly. "But I won't ever be powerless again." Ryan looked up at me then, his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in years. Regret. Melissa remained silent, her posture tense, her confidence gone. Just then, one of the property staff approached from behind me. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said respectfully, holding out a small ring of keys. "These are the updated master keys." I reached out and accepted them. The metal felt cool against my palm. Ryan watched the exchange without speaking. Tenants nearby nodded politely as they passed. Acknowledging, recognizing, respect replacing dismissal. Melissa noticed it too. I could see it in the tight set of her jaw. The shift had happened. Publicly. Irreversibly. Ryan cleared his throat, his voice softer now. "Mom," he said. "Can we talk later?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I closed my hand around the keys and looked back toward the building, toward the life I was rebuilding, toward the strength I had nearly forgotten I possessed. They finally saw me, I thought quietly. Not as a burden. Not as someone to discard, but as someone who had always held power, even when they refused to see it. The morning after everything changed felt quieter than I expected. Sunlight slipped through the thin curtains of my apartment, stretching slowly across the floor until it reached the edge of the table where the building keys rested. I stared at them for a long time before touching them, letting my fingers close gently around the metal. They felt heavier now, not because of their size, but because of what they represented. Power, responsibility, closure. My phone lay beside the keys. A message notification blinked softly on the screen. Ryan's name appeared beneath it, sent late in the night. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside. The street below carried the quiet rhythm of morning, people heading to work, cars moving steadily, life continuing as if nothing dramatic had happened the day before. But for me, everything had changed. Later that morning, I walked into the building that now belonged to me with a clipboard tucked under my arm. The hallway smelled fresher than it had just days earlier. Maintenance workers moved steadily from one unit to another, checking pipes, replacing broken fixtures, tightening loose rails. Tenants greeted me differently now. Not with suspicion, not with hesitation, with quiet respect. An older woman stepped carefully into the hallway as I passed, her hand resting against the wall for balance. "Good morning," she said softly. "Good morning," I replied. She studied my face for a moment, then smiled, a tired but grateful smile. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" I asked gently. "For stopping those eviction notices," she replied. "I didn't know where I would have gone." Her voice trembled slightly at the edges. I felt something warm settle deep inside my chest. "You're safe here," I told her. And for the first time in weeks, I believed my own words. Days passed slowly, but not painfully. Work crews repaired leaking pipes, repainted damaged walls, and replaced flickering lights. The building began to breathe differently, lighter, stronger, steadier. With each repair completed, I felt something inside myself repairing too. One afternoon, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Ryan. This time, I opened it. "Mom, I'm sorry. I know words aren't enough, but I need to see you. Please." I read the message twice. Then once more, regret sat heavy between the lines. The next day, I agreed to meet him. We chose a small coffee shop across town, neutral ground, quiet enough for difficult conversations. When I walked inside, Ryan was already seated at a corner table. He stood the moment he saw me, his movements hesitant, uncertain. Melissa wasn't with him. That alone spoke louder than any apology. He looked thinner than I remembered. Tired, worn down in ways that couldn't be hidden. "Mom," he said quietly. I nodded and sat across from him. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy with everything left unsaid. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly. The words came out quickly, as if he feared losing the chance to say them. "I should have stopped it that night," he continued. "I should have protected you." His hands trembled slightly against the edge of the table. "I trusted Melissa to handle paperwork," he added. "I didn't check. I didn't question anything. I listened without interrupting." He swallowed hard before continuing. "When I saw your name on that ownership notice, I felt ashamed," he admitted. Ashamed of what I allowed to happen. Regret filled his voice now, real regret. Not forced. I took a slow breath before answering. "Forgiveness," I said quietly. "Is possible?" His eyes lifted slightly. "But trust," I continued, "takes time." He nodded slowly, understanding settling across his face. "I won't move back," I added gently. "I need to live independently now." The words didn't sound harsh. They sounded necessary. Ryan lowered his head briefly. "I understand," he said. And for the first time, I believed he truly did. That afternoon, I returned to the building again. Children laughed in the courtyard as I walked past. A maintenance worker waved from the far end of the hall. Someone had placed fresh flowers near the entrance, adding color to the once dull space. Life had returned to this place. Not perfectly, but steadily. Weeks passed, and the transformation became visible everywhere. Fresh paint covered stained walls. Lights stayed on without flickering. The leaking ceiling that once worried tenants had been fully repaired. One evening, I climbed the narrow stairs to the rooftop and stood quietly beneath the fading sunset. The sky stretched wide above the city, painted with soft shades of orange and violet. Below me, lights flickered on one by one, filling the streets with quiet warmth. I held the keys loosely in my hand, letting the cool metal press gently into my palm. For a moment, my thoughts returned to that night, the driveway, the broken dish, the slammed door, the humiliation, the silence. the loneliness. Then I looked around at the building beneath me, at the lives now protected by the decisions I had made. This wasn't revenge. It was restoration. A quiet form of payback built not from anger, but from strength. I remembered something my husband once told me. People will underestimate you, he had said, not because you're weak, but because you're patient. Standing there now, I finally understood what he meant. Being underestimated had become my advantage. Being dismissed had forced me to rediscover my own power. That night, as I locked my apartment door and prepared for bed, I paused for a moment in the hallway. Neighbors passed with gentle nods. Soft laughter drifted from one of the nearby units. The building felt alive, not just as a structure, but as a community. Peace had returned. Not perfect peace. Earned peace. Before turning off the lights, I sat quietly at the kitchen table, letting the stillness settle around me. And I thought about how many people carry silent strength inside them. Strength no one sees until the moment it becomes necessary. If you've ever been made to feel small, if someone in your life treated you like you didn't matter, I hope this story reminds you of something important. Your value isn't decided by how others treat you. It's built quietly, day after day, in the choices you make and the strength you carry. And sometimes, the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who teach you exactly how strong you truly are. If this story reminded you of a moment in your own life, a time when you stood back up after being pushed down, I'd love to hear about it. Share your story in the comments. And if you believe dignity should never be taken away, stay here with us, because there are more stories of strength, justice, and quiet payback waiting to be told. Don't forget to subscribe, so you don't miss the next one.